late 1990 in America. The story takes place in a small, peaceful town where everyone knows each other and life seems calm and quiet. It's the type of town where people live close-knit lives and the streets are lined with beautiful homes. But beneath this calm surface, there are secrets waiting to be revealed. In this town, everything appears perfect on the outside, but there are hidden struggles and emotions that will soon come to light. People often keep to themselves, unaware of the complicated lives others lead. This is where the tragedy begins, involving a sweet, elderly woman and her secret love affair with two men. Evelyn Carter is a 70-something widow, known in the town for being kind and friendly. She had been happily married to her husband, Harold, until his death several years ago. After Harold's passing, Evelyn found herself lonely and yearned for company. Evelyn's loneliness led her to become involved with two much younger men, both of whom she had a secret relationship with. She kept these relationships hidden from her family and friends. Evelyn was still a loving grandmother, but her heart was caught between the two men, James and Brian. These affairs became a dangerous secret, one that would soon tear everything apart. James Mitchell, a 45-year-old successful local businessman, was well known and liked by the community. He was a hard-working and respected man. After Harold's death, James began helping Evelyn around her house and soon developed feelings for her. James became close to Evelyn and started a secret romantic relationship with her. He was caring and attentive, making her feel loved and wanted again. Although their relationship grew strong, James kept it a secret, fearing how people would react to a man his age dating an older woman. Brian Harris, 35 years old, was a charming but troubled man. He had known Evelyn for years because he was a friend of her late husband, Harold. Over time, Brian's feelings for Evelyn deepened, and what began as a friendship turned into a secret affair. Brian didn't know that Evelyn was also seeing James. He believed their bond was special and unique. He had his own struggles in life, but his connection with Evelyn seemed to give him comfort. As he fell deeper in love with her, he became more jealous of James and their relationship. After being alone for many years, following her husband's death, Evelyn was finally getting the attention and love she had longed for. Two men, James and Brian, both gave her affection and care, making her feel special again. James, a successful businessman, was steady and dependable. Brian, on the other hand, was more spontaneous and passionate. Both men made her feel wanted, and she enjoyed the attention each of them gave her. However, Evelyn also felt guilty. She knew that she was secretly seeing both men and keeping it from them. She had always considered herself an honest person, but now she was hiding the truth. Each time she spent time with one of them, she felt a pang of guilt. She was deceiving both men, but at the same time, she couldn't help wanting the affection they offered. She convinced herself that after so many years of loneliness, she deserved the attention. Still, the guilt built up inside her, knowing she was not being fair to either man. Evelyn's children and grandchildren had no idea what was going on in her personal life. To them, she was simply a loving grandmother who was finally getting out more and socializing. They had seen her become more withdrawn after her husband's death, so they were happy to see her smiling again. She was going out with James, and sometimes with Brian, and they were glad she was no longer alone. Evelyn kept her secret from her family. She didn't want them to judge her or think badly of her. They believed James was just a companion, helping her through tough times, and Brian was an old family friend. As long as they saw her happy, Evelyn didn't feel the need to tell them the truth. She knew they would never understand or accept what she was doing. As Evelyn juggled her secret relationship with both James and Brian, the situation became more stressful. She made sure to keep the men apart, arranging her time so that neither of them would know about the other. If James came to visit, she'd tell Brian she wasn't feeling well or was busy with something else. If Brian was over, she'd make excuses to keep James away. But the more Evelyn kept up this secret life, the more difficult it became. James and Brian were both becoming attached to her, and Evelyn could sense that they were starting to expect more from her. She was getting scared that one of them would find out. The tension between the men started to build. James seemed to be becoming more possessive, and Brian was getting jealous. Evelyn began to feel trapped, unsure how much longer she could keep up the lies. She knew that the truth would eventually come out, and when it did, the consequences would be serious. The love triangle that had once seemed harmless was turning into a dangerous situation. Evelyn felt overwhelmed and fearful, knowing she could not continue this secret life for much longer without it all falling apart. As time went on, Brian began to grow more and more frustrated with Evelyn's constant evasiveness. She would cancel plans at the last minute, give vague excuses, or seem distracted when they were together. Brian, who had known Evelyn for years, sensed that something wasn't right. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from him, so he decided to follow her one evening. That night, Evelyn had told Brian she would be staying home, but when he saw her leaving the house and heading out in her car, his suspicions grew. Quietly, he followed her, keeping a safe distance to avoid being noticed. As he trailed behind her, he saw her pull into James' driveway, the house where they had spent countless hours together. Brian's heart sank as the truth hit him. Evelyn had been meeting James all along. Hurt and angry, Brian waited for Evelyn to leave. When she finally emerged from James' house, he confronted her in the driveway, demanding the truth. At first, Evelyn tried to deny it, but the look of betrayal on Brian's face left her with no choice but to admit what had been going on. She confessed that she had been seeing James, but she downplayed its significance. She told Brian that she loved both of them, and that she simply didn't want to choose between the two. She begged him to understand that she hadn't meant to hurt him, but she couldn't let go of either relationship. Brian was devastated. He had always known that their connection was more than just friendship, and now to hear that Evelyn was in love with him and James was a crushing blow. He had thought they shared something special, but now he felt like nothing more than a fool. The anger inside him burned as he realized that he had been lied to all along. It wasn't long before James began to notice Evelyn's strange behavior as well. She had become distant and less available, and there were moments when she seemed distracted or anxious. James had always trusted her, but now his intuition told him something was wrong. His suspicions grew when he began to notice odd things, vague answers to simple questions, and the way she would become defensive when he asked about Brian. One evening, after Evelyn had spent the day with Brian, James decided to do some digging. He asked around, speaking to people who knew Evelyn, and eventually the truth came out. A mutual acquaintance revealed that Evelyn had been secretly seeing Brian for months. Shocked and hurt, James confronted Evelyn about the affair. When she admitted everything, his world came crashing down. He had never expected to be betrayed like this, especially not by Evelyn. The pain he felt was overwhelming, but what shocked him even more was the realization that Evelyn wasn't truly committed to him. Instead of walking away, though, James decided he would fight for her. He loved Evelyn deeply and wasn't ready to give up on their relationship, even if it meant confronting Brian and trying to win her back. James felt betrayed, but his desire to be with Evelyn outweighed his anger. Couldn't understand why she had kept them both in the dark, but he was willing to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He vowed to prove to Evelyn that he could be the one to make her happy, and that he was willing to do whatever it took to show her that she had to choose him. After James discovered Evelyn's secret relationship with Brian, his emotions were a mixture of betrayal, hurt, and determination. He was not about to let another man take Evelyn from him. With his confidence shaken, but his love for her still strong, James confronted Brian directly. He made it clear that he was not going to back down, warning Brian to stay away from Evelyn, claiming that their relationship was real and meaningful. He reminded Brian that he had been there for Evelyn when she was grieving her husband, that he had supported her emotionally, and that she needed him. James, feeling betrayed by both Evelyn and Brian, started to see the situation as a battle for Evelyn's heart. In his mind, he was the man who had invested time, love, and care into their relationship, and he wasn't about to let Brian, a man he saw as an opportunist, destroy everything he had worked for. He believed that he was the one who could truly make Evelyn happy, not Brian. But Brian refused to back down. The confrontation only fueled his anger and determination. He believed that Evelyn was emotionally connected to him in a way she wasn't with James. He was convinced that Evelyn had always loved him, even though she had been hiding it for so long. For Brian, this wasn't just about a romantic rivalry. It was about the truth, about claiming what he thought was rightfully his. The hostility between James and Brian escalated. They exchanged heated words whenever they crossed paths, each man defending his claim to Evelyn. It wasn't just a simple rivalry anymore. It was personal, bitter, and filled with animosity. The once civil small town, where Evelyn had lived peacefully for years, became a battleground for her affection, and the tension between the two men grew unbearable. Evelyn, caught in the middle of the escalating conflict, found herself torn apart. She had never expected her relationships with James and Brian to spiral out of control. She loved them both, in different ways, and the thought of choosing one over the other filled her with dread. She'd always been able to juggle her secret life, but now the pressure of keeping up the charade was overwhelming. Evelyn could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Every time James and Brian fought, she felt like she was suffocating. The guilt and stress took a toll on her health. She began experiencing frequent headaches, insomnia, and anxiety. She had always been a strong woman, but the emotional strain was starting to affect her physical well-being. She couldn't eat or sleep properly, and her once energetic spirit was beginning to fade. Evelyn knew that her life had become a ticking time bomb. She had made choices that were leading her down a dangerous path, and she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Her health was deteriorating under the pressure, and the constant fighting between James and Brian only made things worse. She felt trapped, unable to escape the toxic love triangle she had created. Deep down, Evelyn knew the situation was reaching a breaking point. She could sense that the conflict between James and Brian was only going to escalate, and she feared for what might happen if things went too far. She couldn't keep living this way. Something had to give. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that no matter what choice she made, someone would be hurt. The tension was growing out of control, and Evelyn's heart ached, knowing that her decisions had led to this point. The moment they stepped into her living room, the air was thick with tension. James and Brian stood at opposite ends of the room, glaring at each other, both filled with resentment. Evelyn tried to speak, but each time she did, the men interrupted her, accusing each other and pointing fingers. The arguments grew louder, and the room became charged with hostility. Evelyn tried desperately to intervene, begging them to stop, but her pleas were ignored as the conflict intensified. At some point, the argument escalated into shouting, and in a fit of rage, James suddenly stormed out of the room. When he returned, he was holding a gun. He had brought it with him earlier, hoping to intimidate Brian into backing off. The sight of the weapon only intensified the fear and anger in the room. Evelyn begged James to put the gun down, but in the heat of the moment, everything spiraled out of control. In the chaotic, volatile atmosphere, James and Brian continued to shout at each other. James, trembling with fury, raised the gun. He meant to threaten Brian, to scare him into submission, but in the frantic back and forth, the gun went off. The loud bang echoed through the house, and for a moment, everything went silent. Evelyn's heart stopped as she saw both men fall to the ground, blood quickly pooling around them. It happened so quickly, too quickly for her to stop it. James had fired the gun in a moment of uncontrollable rage, but the violence was far worse than either of them could have ever imagined. Both men had been struck, and they lay motionless on the floor. The argument had escalated beyond any point of return, and now both men were dead. The shooting looked like a double homicide, but there were no witnesses except Evelyn. She was in shock, unable to process what had just happened. The two men she had once loved and cared for were gone, killed in an outburst of violence that no one had seen coming. Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to comprehend the horror of the situation. Her life, and the lives of everyone involved, had changed in an instant. Evelyn stood frozen in place, her mind racing but unable to make sense of anything. Her eyes were wide with disbelief as she stared at the bodies of James and Brian, both lifeless on her living room floor. She had never wanted this, never imagined things could escalate so far. She had hoped for a reconciliation, for a way to make peace between the two men, but now her world was collapsing around her. The guilt hit her immediately, but it was mixed with sheer terror. How could this have happened? She had never meant for either of them to get hurt. She had never wanted anyone to die. But now, the men she had been so close to, each of them in their own way, were gone, and she was the one left to deal with the consequences. Panic set in. Evelyn's heart raced as she looked around, wondering what to do. Should she call the police? But how could she explain it? Would anyone believe her? She could already imagine the accusations. How could she possibly justify what had just happened? She was terrified. Her life, which had been full of secrets and lies, had now spiraled into something far worse. The once quiet suburban neighborhood she lived in would soon be rocked by this tragic double murder, and Evelyn would have to live with the aftermath. Alone, devastated, and responsible for the deaths of two men who had meant so much to her. When local authorities arrived at the scene, they were faced with a tragic and baffling situation. Both James and Brian were dead, and Evelyn was the only person present. At first, it seemed like an open and shut case. There was a weapon involved, and the deaths appeared to be the result of a violent confrontation. Evelyn, an elderly woman with a history of relationships with both men, quickly became the primary suspect. Detectives questioned Evelyn immediately, but her shock and distress made it difficult to get clear answers. She claimed that the deaths were an accident, that the gun had gone off during a heated argument, but her inconsistent statements raised doubts. Given her age and the fact that she had been known as a sweet, elderly woman in her community, some of the officers were hesitant to immediately label her as a criminal. Her reputation in the small town was mostly positive, and many found it hard to believe that she could have been capable of such violence. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted to whether the deaths were the result of an accident or something more deliberate. Evelyn's relationships with both men were brought up, and detectives examined her motives. Was it a crime of passion, spurred by jealousy and anger? Or was it truly a tragic accident that spiraled out of control? They delved into the nature of the love triangle, interviewing family members and neighbors who had known Evelyn for years. Some saw her as a victim of circumstance, an elderly woman caught between two men who were both vying for her affection, but others wondered if her feelings had been more manipulative than she had let on. Despite her claims that it was an accident, the investigation continued to scrutinize Evelyn's role in the deaths. The presence of the gun, the heated argument, and the fact that she had invited both men into her home all pointed to the possibility that she might have been more involved than she had let on. As weeks passed, the case gained media attention. It wasn't long before Evelyn was formally charged with manslaughter. Trial, set in the small town's courthouse, became a spectacle. The community was divided. Many were sympathetic to Evelyn, believing that she had been caught in an impossible situation, while others were skeptical of her story, convinced that she had played a more active role in the deaths than she admitted. Evelyn's defense team argued that the shooting was unintentional, a tragic result of an argument gone wrong. They painted a picture of a woman who was overwhelmed by the emotions of a complicated love triangle and who had never meant for things to escalate to violence. Her age and mental state at the time were considered mitigating factors, and her defense team argued that she was not in control of her actions when the gun was fired. Evelyn's family members, particularly her children, stood by her, insisting that she was a victim of circumstance and that the tragedy was beyond anyone's control. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that Evelyn had acted recklessly and that the events leading up to the shooting were too calculated to be dismissed as an accident. They pointed to the fact that she had invited both men to her home on the night of the incident, knowing the tension between them. The prosecution suggested that Evelyn had allowed the situation to spiral out of control and that her actions led to the deaths of both men. The case painted a portrait of an elderly woman caught up in a web of emotional manipulation, but also one who had failed to take responsibility for her actions. The trial captivated the nation. Media outlets from across the country followed the case, fascinated by the complicated love triangle and the dramatic events that had led to the double murder. The public became fixated on Evelyn's relationships with James and Brian, as well as the mysterious circumstances surrounding their deaths. Was Evelyn truly the victim of a tragic set of circumstances, or had she played a darker role in the murders? In the end, the jury returned with a controversial verdict. Evelyn was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, with the jury acknowledging that her actions had led to the deaths but were not premeditated. Court took into account her age, her mental state at the time, and the emotional toll the entire situation had caused. Evelyn's age and frailty played a significant role in the sentencing, as did the fact that she had never intended for either man to die. The judge sentenced her to a reduced prison term, one that reflected her age and the tragic nature of the case. While some in the community accepted the verdict, believing that Evelyn's punishment was fair given the circumstances, others felt that justice had not been fully served. The case left a lasting impact on everyone involved, and the tragedy of Evelyn's love triangle, once seen as a complicated but relatively harmless situation, had turned into a devastating series of events that no one could have anticipated. For Evelyn, the reality of her actions weighed heavily on her, and she would spend the rest of her life grappling with the consequences of the choices she had made. After the trial, Evelyn's family was left devastated. Her children and grandchildren, who had once seen her as a loving grandmother, couldn't believe what had happened. They struggled to understand how she could be involved in the deaths of two men, and the shock of it all tore the family apart.